I want to go to another great guest. We're joined with the one and only Caleb Maupin. Caleb Maupin, he's a good friend of the show. He's also a speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, and author. Caleb, how you doing, my man? By the way, Center for Political Innovation.
Yes.
Correct?
Yes, that's my organization, and
it popped into my mind all at once. Just one word: Center for Political Innovation.
Yeah,
I didn't even write it down.
Yeah, that's us.
Yeah.
No, I'm doing pretty well. Back from Chicago, we just had the CPI National Convention, and been looking over the news. And I mean, it's good to see that RussiaGate story go down in flames finally. I mean, you and I knew it was fake from the beginning, but it's good to see some confirmation of that. Certainly worried about world events on a number of levels, but, glad to be here with you, right?
Well, I'm glad to have you, man. I really am. I always enjoy talking to you. I think I've told you before. I think I've even said to the audience, I can listen to Caleb go on pretty much any issue for like your knowledge of that stuff is just so on point. I'm curious from your take, what is the one issue that seems to be concerning you the most on the world stage?
Well, I am obviously hugely disappointed in the White House. I was hoping that they meant what they said on the campaign trail. It's interesting. I think Lenin wrote about how elections can be a measure of popular will. And I think it's good that people voted for Trump when he promised peace. I think it's just, very disappointing that he didn't deliver, but we shouldn't be surprised, really, because that's kind of the nature of the game, right? That at the end of the day, it's not about, who's in office. It's about the system that we're up against, and it's about the balance of forces. But that said, there's a number of things on my mind, one of which is the Trump-Musk break. Now, Elon Musk is somebody I'm not a huge fan of, but he has billions of dollars. He's supposedly the richest person in the world. Now, I don't, that whole thing about who's the richest person in the world, Forbes magazine comes out with that list. And I've always said that list is not legit, because the richest people in the world, you can't even measure their wealth, right? The Rockefellers, the DuPonts, the Carnegies, the really wealthy families, they don't even know how much money they have. And, I think when one of the Rockefellers was trying to become vice president in the 1970s, they actually did a deep dive. The New York Times and all these big investigators tried to figure out just how much money he had, and they couldn't figure it out. It was so fast. So, they say Elon Musk is the richest man in the world. No, I'd say Elon Musk is so poor he has to keep his money in his own name. That's what it really gets down to. I don't think he's the richest man in the world. But that said, he's broken with Trump, and apparently part of the break is Trump bombing Iran, is support for Israel, is the Epstein list, and I'm getting together, Center for Political Innovation and us, in the next few days. We're going to come out with a petition. We want Elon Musk to call a huge anti-war rally in Washington, D.C. That's what we want to do with all his billions of dollars, with his disappointment with the White House, and with his anti-war, anti-Israel stance. It appears he's more anti-Israel than we suspected. He needs to use his money, put his money where his mouth is, and gather thousands of people to have a big moment in Washington, D.C. against the drive toward war. That's what we want to make happen. And you're hearing it first, actually. I'm debuting it. I haven't talked to my audience about this yet. But that is going to be a big push that the Center for Political Innovation is going to have. We want Elon Musk to call a national anti-war protest.
I feel privileged. Thank you for that. He has so much money. Yeah. And like you said, like many of these other people, there's no way to know what that number is. And I would say it's not really an exact to the penny for Musk either, because a lot of the stuff is held in stocks and all these other things. But I have mixed feelings about billionaires being in the political space. People like George Soros, people like, what is the other guy? Like the way they would use their money in order to affect elections abroad in the United States is usually not to the good or to the better ends. It's usually just another way for them to maximize their profit. I mean, even Twitter, when he buys Twitter, he makes it seem like, and I guess I don't want to disagree with you on this, but I guess it makes it seem like, hey, I'm just doing this for free speech, until it's something that's going after Elon Musk, in which case he mixes whatever they're talking about. But I don't know, maybe you can get him, especially now that he's annoyed at Donald Trump, he's pissed off at Trump. For the Epstein thing, for example, he comes out and says, you need to release the files. Now, I agree with him on this, because we have a problem with the Epstein thing. If indeed Epstein is what people said he is, this Mossad spy that was allowing, basically feeding kids to adults to rape, and then using video footage or some kind of audio footage to blackmail, okay, then we have a serious problem with our government. And that needs to be shown that there is not a problem there. Because by all measure of the way that the American public thinks, that information is there. We don't know how Epstein got his money. And I don't mean to go into Epstein on this. I'm just pointing out that when Musk put that out, okay, that's somewhat of a lightning rod. That's a big deal. Would he support anti-war protests? Maybe, especially since it's against Donald Trump now, because Donald Trump has effectively betrayed his base. He might.
Well, it's worth a try on our part, and
Yeah.
I think we need to just call for it and see if the call catches on, and see if we can nudge things towards happening. We did just have our national convention in Chicago. We gave
How'd
an
it go, by
award.
the way?
Oh, it went great. We gave an award to Angela McCurdle of the Libertarian Party for organizing Rage Against the War Machine. We gave an award to the Uhuru movement. They were able to send a representative, even though their organization is kind of in a state of emergency right now due to the tornadoes in Missouri that have just displaced all kinds of people, and they're in the middle of a big struggle. But Kabula represented them. He was the representative who was sent on their behalf. We had Sayed Husseini, a very important Iranian American, social media personality. He was there. We were able to, hear great remarks from him. It overall went pretty well, and I'm editing lots of video. I've got lots of video to edit in front of me, and I've been releasing one video a day. So keep your eye on that. Quite exciting over on my YouTube channel there. But what was great was we got to spend 7 days with the team, 7 days of, just being together. We got to visit the Haymarket Memorial at the Fort Home Cemetery in Chicago. That's where, it's a historic site in the history of, labor struggles and socialism and such. And we had a long Q&A session that's also going to go up online where people asked a lot of questions and shared, what they're involved in. And it went really well. I feel pretty good about it.
That's very cool.
We're very excited. And now our next thing is going to be this big push to see if, hey, it's not a matter of Elon Musk being good or bad. It's the matter of him having billions of dollars, him having broken with the White House over an anti-war stance. I mean, we need to push the struggle forward, right? And if he would actually do that, right, which he very well might do, if he would actually do that, that would be a great thing. And I think the thing is that most people don't think in terms of protests, right? I know he wants to launch this America Party. There'll be a party that runs against the Democrats and Republicans in elections. Well, that's great. I'm not opposed to electoral activism, but ultimately, look, history is made by protests. And, I'm excited to start going through the King files that have just been released. Right. I know the files related to the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. have just been made public. And so let's hope that we can find some more information about that. I mean, I know the King family has already won a settlement in court against the U.S. government for complicity in the killing. So, I mean, it's like the idea that the U.S. government had something to do with King's death is not something that we should be shocked to find out about it. And it's kind of old news. It just hasn't gotten mainstream play before. I used to work for Ramsey Clark, who was the U.S. Attorney General under Lyndon Johnson, and he very well believed. I mean, it was no secret as far as he was concerned that the FBI and others had a hand in the death of MLK. He saw that as just kind of obvious, and to a lot of activists, it was obvious. At the time that Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, Mao Zedong was the leader of China. He actually put out a statement on the death of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And in that statement, he blamed the U.S. government for it. He said that the U.S. imperialists killed Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., spared him no mercy, even though he was an advocate of nonviolence. And so I don't think people around the world are shocked by the fact that the U.S. government may have been involved to some degree or other in the death of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. What I do think would be good is if that was something that people in the United States were made blatantly aware of, because we have this holiday in honor of him. And when I was a kid, I learned that he gave a speech one time and he said, "I have a dream." And ever since then, there's been no racism ever again in American history, right? And it was all solved, and now we can all just move on. But it'd be good for people to learn the whole story there, including how he became an anti-imperialist in his final years of life, how he began saying the issue was a class struggle, right, and mobilizing, and how he was, I tell people Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was shot down on a picket line. I mean, he wasn't literally on a picket line in Memphis, Tennessee, but he went to Memphis to support a strike of sanitation workers who were striking for better pay and better conditions. And he was killed then in Memphis, Tennessee, supporting workers after he'd come out against the Vietnam War. So there's a lot there. And let's hope that those documents being released can start that conversation.
Didn't they pull a security detail after he came out against the Vietnam War? I mean, his argument made all the sense in the world. Effectively, the Great Society hit his head on the shores of Vietnam. How are we claiming to be this great society when we're over there killing people in a foreign country? That's when LBJ pulled this security detail. Or am I getting this wrong? Do I remember this wrong?
I'm not aware of that aspect of things. I mean, I know that he lost a lot of support when he came out against the Vietnam War, he was condemned by the NAACP for doing so, actually, an official condemnation. And he gave a speech at Riverside Church in New York City. That was where he officially came out against the war. And the speech he gave was called Beyond Vietnam. It's a very powerful speech. You can listen to recordings of it online. In that speech, he actually talks about how people all over the world are rising up against conditions of poverty, and that we in the West must support these revolutions it's a really powerful speech that's critical of capitalism, that basically, he was an advocate of nonviolence, but he basically says the Vietnamese are right to fight for their national liberation against U.S. imperialism, against French colonialism. Very, very powerful. And then, his last book that he wrote before he was killed, Where Do We Go From Here? Talked about full employment and how there should be universal employment, how the state should provide jobs to everyone, and how, mobilizing around the demand of full employment could be, the way forward. And he was working with Michael Harrington, who was eventually founded Democratic Socialists of America, who was kind of one of these, State Department socialists. And they were trying to do some kind of low-income people mobilization on Washington, D.C. They wanted to have mass civil disobedience demanding full employment. And in the context of the economic and political crisis of the 1960s, if he had been able to do that as someone who was opposing the Vietnam War and supporting the Vietnamese, as somebody who was trying to make the already, mass movement at the time against racism and against the Vietnam War a class movement, trying to get, working people involved, demanding full employment, who knows what could have happened. And I think that, he was killed because at that point he was much more dangerous to the status quo at that point, And
that's the rub, right? Like he realized, it's one thing now, civil rights, but okay, I respect you as a man as you lay dying on the sidewalk, broke, poor, and hungry. It's like you can't have you need the economic liberation before you can get the civil liberation. Like both have to be in tandem. You can't have this kind of sea of poor people of a particular demographic and expect them to be treated as equals, and B, for them to see themselves as equals when they're living in dire poverty. I mean, he's not wrong in this. And I think the sad part is that when the Democratic Party talks about him, they completely remove the element of him being a socialist from him and talk about him purely as this civil rights icon, as if these things were somehow mutually exclusive of each other. They weren't.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty wild. And then the details of the assassination. I mean, one thing, first of all, James Earl Ray, who killed Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., which I guess there are some witnesses who say he was not the shooter, but he's the person that was ultimately arrested. I guess he was part of the Friends of Rhodesia Club, which was a group of people that supported the apartheid regime of what is now called Zimbabwe, right?
Zimbabwe. I'm sorry. You're right.
Yeah. And that, I guess that, because the people of Zimbabwe, there was an anti-colonial uprising going on. There were various racists from around the world who were going to Rhodesia, or what is now Zimbabwe, to fight against the black majority that was being armed by the Soviet Union and China. And eventually they won in the 80s. They had the agreement, the Lancaster House Agreement, and ultimately that's, we have modern Zimbabwe. But I guess James Earl Ray was involved in the struggle to defend Rhodesia from the anti-colonial revolution. The other thing is that James Earl Ray also left the country very quickly. After the death of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., he was actually apprehended in France, which is very strange. Like, how did he get all the way to France? After multiple people saw him, shoot Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Now there are some, I don't know exactly what went on, on that day. There are a couple, most of the witnesses agree that James Earl Ray was the shooter. There are a couple witnesses who didn't. James Bevel, the civil rights leader, James Bevel, who was a witness on the scene, he maintained, until the day he died, that it was not James Earl Ray that pulled the trigger. And he was, somebody who'd worked closely with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and had kind of a strange life. You can read about the life of James Bevel. It's a very bizarre story, but he maintained until his death that he was there. It was not James Earl Ray. There's also there are many people that have looked at that famous photo after the death of MLK and seen the crowd of people pointing, and many people have said, why are they not ducking in case there's another shot? Right. And many people have looked at that.
Yeah. I mean, because go ahead. No, sorry.
So that's a fair question, I guess. But I and said, hey, this guy was just shot, from a rooftop, and and the people are not like covering their heads. Instead, they're all standing up and pointing. This is where the shot came from. Like, people have said that's a little suspicious, but I don't know about that. But at the same time, I mean, it very well could have been James Earl Ray, who was indeed the shooter. And he could have had some help getting to France. I mean, I don't know exactly what has happened, and that the details, I guess, that of the court proceedings where the King family sued the U.S. government, a lot of that is sealed. They did receive a settlement from the American government that ruled there was complicity by the American government in the assassination. So that seems to indicate that on some level, and I would suspect that if there was anybody who was involved in it, it would have been the FBI. That's my suspicion, because the FBI's director was J. Edgar Hoover, and J. Edgar Hoover really hated Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., had like a personal vendetta against Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I mean, had sent him letters urging him to commit suicide, had leaked images of him. So I guess Bayard Rustin was one of MLK's close associates, and Bayard Rustin was kind of, he was very much the genius behind the civil rights movement, but he couldn't be a public face of it because he was gay and because he was a former member of the Communist Party. And Bayard Rustin and Martin Luther King Jr. shared a hotel room, and I guess there was a photograph from a hidden camera in the hotel room of MLK in the bathtub, with Bayard Rustin sitting on the toilet. They were having a conversation. And they released this photo to say that MLK was gay because he's in the bathtub naked with a gay guy sitting on the toilet, and they tried to use that to destroy MLK's reputation. And that was the FBI released that. And that there were all kinds of things they did to try and bring down King. And that, like I said, I worked with Ramsey Clark, with the International Action Center. That was who I began my political activism with. And, Ramsey Clark, I mean, he was the U.S. Attorney General, and he was constantly trying to control J. Edgar Hoover. J. Edgar Hoover wasn't listening to Lyndon Johnson, was certainly not beholden to Ramsey Clark, who was the head of the Department of Justice, and was not beholden to President Johnson. J. Edgar Hoover did whatever he wanted, and he had wiretap blackmail on everybody, and he had a personal vendetta against the civil rights movement, and he was a hard right anti-communist, whereas Lyndon Johnson and Ramsey Clark, they had been from that kind of the Cold War liberalism school. Their attitude at the time, Ramsey Clark eventually became an anti-imperialist, etc. But his attitude at the time was that the USA needed to deal with the issue of Jim Crow segregation and other things to maintain its credibility around the world. That they couldn't condemn the Soviet Union while they had Jim Crow back in the United States, and the civil rights movement was necessary. And that if you didn't have Martin Luther King Jr., you were going to have a much more radical movement that would possibly threaten the security of the United States. And Ramsey Clark, he was very much involved in releasing people from federal prison in big numbers. Releasing a lot of people from federal prison. He was involved in really emphasizing that crime is linked to economic problems,
Yes.
and that the Department of Justice and its efforts to end crime should work with the Great Society and the social programs that could make it so people are not in conditions that would drive them toward criminal behavior and such. And Ramsey Clark was a great man in many, many ways. And it was really an honor for me to be able to work with him, to go to his apartment, I had the job of delivering food to his apartment. That was one of the things I did, right? Is because, there were a lot of Syrians who really appreciated his word, and they were always, sending free food to the IAC office. And so he obviously didn't live there. And so I would take the food over to his home, and, the doorman would meet me. I'd go upstairs and bring Ramsey Clark some food. And, he was a really great man. And the FBI was not under his control. And the FBI, as far as he was concerned, the FBI killed Martin Luther King Jr. As far as he was concerned. So, I'm curious to see these new documents that have been released. And that has been kind of known around the world for years. But we'll see what these new documents say. So there you go.
Wow. It's amazing how, even with JFK, we kind of accept that the CIA had him killed, or at the very least has something to do with having him killed. It's very weird when you think about it. Like a wing of the government killed the president of the United States, or in this case, a wing of the government killed Martin Luther King because of the impact that he was having in larger society. It's just wild. Like, I think the wild part is we accept it, if that makes sense. It's like you become so thoroughly comfortable with it that after a while, it's not astonishing. It just becomes normal information, which shouldn't become normal information because we're talking about an agency of the government murdering the head of the executive branch of that same government. And in this case, for Martin Luther King, I don't think it's any less shocking. Like, or at the very least, it shouldn't be any less shocking. The notion that one of the branches of government goes and murders, or potentially has something to do with the murder and execution of a civil rights leader is outrageous. It's just outrageous. And I get all the pointing, but it depends on the gravity by which they saw Martin Luther King. Like, if you are imbuing this guy with a huge amount of integrity, a huge amount of oomph in regards to him being a person, that you love that guy. And I mean it in the sense of, I love what this person is doing. This person is an icon, etc. And that person gets shot. Is your first thought of yourself, or is your first thought, hey, I saw the bullet come from that direction? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I don't know the answer to it. That's why I don't want to immediately flag and say Jesse Jackson has something to do with King being killed because Jesse was pointing in the direction of the shooter, if that makes sense.
Sure. Yeah. And I mean, like I said, I don't really know what happened, right? I mean, like I said, James Bevel, who, there's quite a lot of questions. You look at James Bevel's history, I'm not saying he should necessarily be believed. He was the one who just insisted as an eyewitness that it was not James Earl Ray who pulled the trigger. But, it's possible James Earl Ray did pull the trigger, but, somebody helped him get out of the country and somebody put him up to it or something. I don't know exactly the details. And that's what I'm hoping these documents have. We can kind of get details, right? That's what I'm hoping for. But as far as, look, what was the name of the FBI program that they used to go after Martin Luther King Jr.? COINTELPRO. Right? COINTELPRO. And what does that stand for? Counterintelligence Program. It was Russiagate. That's what they were using to go after him. They maintained that the civil rights movement was a communist plot, that it came from Russia. That was the basis on which the FBI smeared his reputation, claimed he was gay, claimed he was a womanizer, urged him to commit suicide, and wiretapped him for years. That was the basis on which it was. It was because of the fact that Stalin had raised the issue of the oppression of black people
Right.
since the 1920s.
Right.
And that, the term civil rights was first used in relation to the black struggle by the Civil Rights Congress. The Communist Party, after World War II, decided to rebrand their anti-racist work. And they found that. Yeah. They had originally talked about black liberation or Negro liberation. That had been the language that they used. But after World War II, they launched what was called the Civil Rights Congress, which was their mass anti-racist organization that mainly focused on opposing the death penalty in the South, because in the South there were a lot of African Americans were sentenced to death in situations where there weren't there was not evidence, etc. And the Civil Rights Congress was formed by William L. Patterson, who was the leader of the Communist Party, and they began donating money and providing attorneys to black men who were charged with capital offenses in the South. And the Civil Rights Congress became the civil rights became the buzzword that the Communist Party started using in its anti-racist work. What's interesting is Bella Abzug. She was a member of Congress for many years, from like the 1970s and 80s in New York City, representing New York City. She was the lawyer for the Civil Rights Congress. Now, she never joined the Communist Party, but she was from a family that was kind of close to the Communist Party, and she was a young woman with a law degree, and she was an attorney paid by the Civil Rights Congress to represent black men who were charged in the South. She represented a Willie McGee, which was a very famous case at the time, and she eventually became a member of the U.S. Congress. She became a well-known feminist activist and such, and she was in Congress. She was a supporter of Israel. Unfortunately, she was a liberal Zionist, but she was anti-war on many issues, really opposed to the nuclear arms race, and really kind of iconic, speaking up in support of LGBT rights. And her background was with the Civil Rights Congress, and the Civil Rights Congress was also invited to the United Nations by the Soviet Union, which was a permanent, Security Council member. Yeah, and William L. Patterson gave the speech, "We Charge Genocide," to the United Nations, accusing the U.S. government of genocide against African Americans. So, that's the basis on which the FBI said, "Oh, this civil rights movement is just a communist plot. It's a communist conspiracy." And we consider this to be a foreign effort to destabilize the United States. What's interesting, the civil rights movement the modern civil rights movement started with the lynching of Emmett Till, right? The death of Emmett Till, right? A 15-year-old young man was accused of whistling at a white woman, was murdered. And what's interesting about that case is that so Stalin had just died, right? And Khrushchev was the new leader of the Soviet Union. And that the picture of Emmett Till's mutilated body was just shown all over the world by the Soviet Union, right? And they were just showing it to the whole world and saying, this is what America does to black people. They say they're a country of freedom and democracy. Look at this. The mayor of Chicago, Mayor Daley, who was notoriously corrupt, was a Democrat. He spoke up about the case because Emmett Till's family lived in Chicago. And then the Kennedy family started, kind of encouraging people to protest. And there was kind of liberal mobilizations against Jim Crow segregation around the death of Emmett Till. And then it was the United Auto Workers Union that was, a huge labor union that had a lot of history, but they had kicked all the communists out, right? And the United Auto Workers Union and the Kennedy family went ahead and did the Montgomery bus boycott. And there was a feeling that if there wasn't some action from above around the issue of Jim Crow, that this was a ticking time bomb, and it was only a matter of time before much more radical forces, took the issue of black oppression in the United States and the coming social explosion. There was going to be a social explosion around the issue of race in America. That was almost inevitable. They didn't want that explosion to be led by forces that would totally dismantle the system. I mean, they wanted it to be kind of controlled. And so it was really in 1954 that you started to have a civil rights movement from above. But prior to that, it had been communists that had organized around the civil rights issue. And you also had black nationalism that was growing in the northern urban centers, in Detroit and in Pittsburgh and in New York City and other places. You had the Nation of Islam that was rising and had a lot of influence. There was also a guy named Father Divine. People kind of forget about Father Divine, but Father Divine was a black pastor in Harlem who was an advocate of civil rights and was very sympathetic to the Soviet Union and had aligned himself with the Communist Party. And he also had a number of businesses in Harlem that he owned, and he was kind of a black nationalist. And so Father Divine and the Nation of Islam were gaining influence, and on top of that, you had the death of Stalin, and Khrushchev came into power. Khrushchev kind of wanted to negotiate with the United States, and there were all kinds of circumstances that all led to the modern civil rights movement emerging. It's kind of interesting, but the FBI was always opposed to it, and it's interesting. There was a divide. I always talk about the Yankee and Cowboy War. There was a divide in the ruling class because a lot of the military brass are from the South, right? I mean, the U.S. military is disproportionately, the South, and the Southern military brass, the kind of the top generals and all of that tend to be Southern. They wanted nothing to do with the civil rights movement. They viewed it as this is our Southern way of life. They're trying to mess with it, whatever. And the FBI also, had utter contempt for it. So there was kind of a division. The CIA, the Ford Foundation, and a lot of the liberal think tanks, and I mentioned Riverside Church was one of the main supporters of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The Riverside Church is funded by the Rockefeller family. I mean, there's a big picture of John D. Rockefeller there. It's a Rockefeller outlet, and that kind of the liberal Eastern establishment, kind of the ultra rich, said we need to do something about the race issue in the United States. And the FBI doesn't want to cooperate with this, and the military doesn't want to cooperate with this, but the Kennedy family, Mayor Daley in Chicago, and there was kind of a division in the ruling class. And it was through that division we got the big, explosion that happened. But yeah, there was a big division within the American deep state about the issue of Jim Crow. The FBI didn't want to do anything about it. They viewed any effort to kind of tamper with the structures of U.S. society as a communist plot, whereas the Kennedy family and the CIA and the Ford Foundation and a lot of liberals did want to alter things because they thought it would put the USA in a stronger position.
Yeah, you're right. That is Russiagate. Because you're right. They looked at it as a Soviet plot to undermine the United States, basically subversive elements in the United States pushed by the Soviet Union. And then Martin Luther King was this communist Manchurian candidate that was set off like a bomb in America to change American way of life. I guess my thing is, what happened? What changed? Like, there was that much energy in regards to, okay, society needs to change for whatever particular reason. In this case, it was just civil rights. I don't see that today. That energy doesn't seem to be there. It seems to be lost. And I'm not quite sure why.
Well, I think there's a couple factors to keep in mind. But I mean, the main thing is that there was a big adjustment that had to go on in the United States after World War II. Right? The USA at that point had the strongest economy in the world, in the 50s and 60s. Really,
Right.
it was in the 70s that stopped, being the case. And we saw the end of the post-World War II economic expansion. But coming out of World War II, the USA had the strongest economy in the world. And things had changed, and we still had a military draft where military service was kind of mandatory. We still had, legal segregation, and that there was kind of U.S. society needed to adjust, and there was a lot of confusion about that. And so in the context of a booming economy, which there was a booming economy in the late 1960s, I mean, the economy was very, very good. In the context of a booming economy, there was more optimism, and there was a willingness to adjust, and there was a lot of frustration. And that Brzezinski, the big anti-Russian, strategist, he talks about how the profile of a revolutionary around the world and in the Black community in America is a frustrated, newly educated person, and that there was a new number of people in the Black community who had gotten education for the first time, gotten college degrees in the first time, and were frustrated, right? And that the profile, and that this was the same around the world. Your Che Guevaras and your anti-colonial fighters tended to be people from the developing world who got education for the first time and were very frustrated with what they saw, what the education made them aware of. And so the kind of the rise of Black nationalism and the rise of the civil rights movement and the Black liberation movement of the 60s was in the context of a booming economy, in the context of a wave of education and frustrated educated folks, frustrated intellectuals, getting involved and becoming politically active. That was kind of the context there. And we don't have the same energy now because the conditions are very different. Now, the economic conditions now are very bad. Right. And in the context of a very bad economy, in a context of a lot of demoralization and frustration, I do think there is a lot of political energy in the United States. I think people are very angry with the government, et cetera, but they're confused about where to go, and that our leaders are have gotten better at kind of diffusing and manipulating dissent. And pushing people in different confused directions. At one point, I talk about the late Cold War normal, how after the rise of Reagan, from like the early 80s up until the Bush years, there was kind of this normal in American politics of, they say, well, racism is bad, right? We agreed on that. America, we said, oh yes, racism is bad, in a vague kind of way. But America was the greatest country in the world. We're number one, and we're number one because we have freedom, and capitalism is just the greatest system that ever existed. And capitalism and democracy are synonymous. And, that was the way most Americans saw things. And the Republicans really believed that. And the Democrats believed that also, but they were nitpicky. They would raise some of the problems, with poverty or some of the problems with different issues. But that was kind of the standard line in the United States. And the neocons were very key in setting that up, right? Irving Kristol and Leo Strauss, and forces that had been trained by them that kind of assumed control of the Republican Party after Richard Nixon was ousted, after Richard Nixon was pushed out with the rise of Gerald Ford. That became the mainstream of conservatism in the United States. Leo Strauss, the intellectual, his favorite TV show was Gunsmoke. And on the good guy wears a white hat and he's all good. He doesn't have a single flaw. The bad guy wears a black hat and he's all bad, not a single skill or redeeming quality, right? And Leo Strauss said, we need average people in America to see the world like an episode of Gunsmoke, right? And that was what Leo Strauss would tell his followers. Like, there's certain people like us that can understand it. We're the great intellectuals. He loved Plato and his concept of the philosopher kings. But he said average people need to understand the world like an episode of Gunsmoke. And that's Leo Strauss. And he was the guy who was the big brain that the Republican Party, was studying around. And Irving Kristol, who was also a follower of Leo Strauss, and others. And they kind of reinvented American conservatism. And it's not a coincidence, I think, that we had two Republican presidents that actually took on a cowboy persona, right? Ronald Reagan was literally a cowboy Hollywood actor.
Yes, Bush, he
was born in Connecticut, but he moved to Texas and he wore the cowboy hat and he was, was out on his ranch cutting brush and, and they both, he was going to smoke him out. He was going to smoke him out, and that they were playing up that, it was, trying to be, characters in a cowboy movie, and that the late Cold War normal. And I remember this, I was a kid in the 90s and this is how politics was. There were certain things that everybody knew. And it was after the 1960s and 70s and all that confusion, we had come to this weird kind of, consensus that yes, racism is bad, but America is number one. Democracy and capitalism are synonymous, and this is the greatest country in the world. And anyone who doesn't think that must be brainwashed, because everybody knows America is the greatest country in the world. It just is. That kind of thing. That was politics in America, and that didn't really fall apart until the Obama administration. Until 2008, you had the financial crisis, where all of a sudden living standards in the USA were dropping much more rapidly than they had been before. The living standards in the USA had been gradually declining since the mid 70s, but they really started dropping after the 2008 financial crisis. And all of a sudden, the late Cold War normal was over. And Obama came into office, and Obama was a student of Brzezinski. And really, it was the people who'd been ousted by the Reagan Revolution. It was the Carter. Carter also called himself, he said, I am a student of Zbigniew Brzezinski. And it was that the Cold War liberals, and the Brzezinski soft power faction that had been ousted by Reagan, they came back into power for the first time under Obama because economic conditions had gotten to the point that they were able to kind of assume power. And that Eastern establishment, those Rockefeller liberals, the Ford Foundation, those kind of folks, whatever you want to call them, they were in power, and they had a new ally, which was the Silicon Valley tech monopolies and social media. I mean, Barack Obama, that's why if we had just had cable news, Barack Obama probably would never been elected. It was social media, Twitter, Facebook, which were all very new, and the rise of Silicon Valley that kind of brought on this new wave of liberals, if you want to talk about it, woke or whatever. And that was to try and rescue the United States amid an economic crisis. That was the end of the late Cold War normal.
And that sapped the energy. I mean, I guess shouldn't that be the opposite though? at the point where you're having this kind of economic, and I guess we did have Occupy Wall Street during Obama. It just didn't go anywhere.
Well, it was interesting because that's when I was very, very politically active. I was in college when the economy crashed, and then,
Yeah.
what was very sad was that they were still kind of following a Cold War script. And I remember that you remember after the 2008 financial crisis, the cover of Newsweek said, "We're all socialists now." And they were doing New York Times stories about the Brecht Forum, which was like this Center for Marxist Studies in New York. And that, my assessment is basically the government had determined that the communist groups were not a threat to anybody. I mean, they were not going to overthrow the system. But Obama and the Eastern establishment, the Rockefeller liberals, were hoping to, use the energy of the left to kind of push back against the Tea Party. So they gave a huge boost. And Michael Moore made his movie Capitalism, a Love Story, a lot of which was written by Richard Wolff, from what I understand. He wrote a lot of the film, and they just gave a big boost to the communist groups and the left. And they fell on their face. They had underestimated how weak those groups were. I was in one of those communist groups at the time. And I mean, these groups were so damaged by the Cold War, by infiltration, these groups they just couldn't do it. And Occupy Wall Street was almost take two, right? They had hoped they could use the regular left to be their foot soldiers against the Tea Party or whatever. And the communist groups were just so incompetent and just so they couldn't do it. They had nothing. And they had two big events called the US Social Forum. One was in Detroit, one was in Georgia, and there was all kinds of foundation money. And they were hoping to just kind of use the traditional left to go out there, just go get them, Tiger, go do it. And the left just fell on their faces so badly. Occupy Wall Street was like take two, right? Occupy Wall Street was a lot of people from around the world. I was at the beginning of Occupy Wall Street. It was a lot of people there was this intellectual, David Graeber, who had a lot of followers in Greece and Eastern Europe and places like that. And they brought in the color revolution people from around the world to do Occupy Wall Street because the communist groups were just incompetent. They couldn't do it. They just were so badly damaged by everything that had gone on. These are boomers with a lot of trauma, and being a communist in America is not exactly the easiest life to have, and especially not in the 80s and 90s when the communist movement globally is falling apart and all of that, and the communist groups just couldn't do it. And then Occupy Wall Street, and then after Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter kind of took on a new direction with things.
But linger on Occupy Wall Street for a bit, because at a certain point, Obama started using the language from Occupy Wall Street. We're fighting the 1%, despite the fact that Citigroup picked his entire cabinet, or everybody that Citigroup picked ended up in Obama's administration. But he started using that language as a lightning rod. We're fighting the 1%. This is about the 1%, et cetera, et cetera. I didn't know about the communist part. My knowledge of it went to them taking over the park in New York City. And then when the U.S. government got tired of it, the U.S. government started working with state government in order to get those people out. It's like, okay, you've accomplished your objective. I've been elected. Time for you to go. That was the way I remembered and understood it.
It was interesting because at the time Occupy Wall Street was happening, they dedicated the Martin Luther King Memorial in Washington, D.C. And Barack Obama gave a speech, and he said, if Martin Luther King were alive today, he'd be at Occupy Wall Street. And everyone was just so moved by it. At the same time, Barack Obama was having calls behind the scenes with the police departments of all the major cities about how to clear and beat up and arrest all the Occupy protesters. I mean, it was weird. The Democrats very much wanted Occupy to push back against the Tea Party, but at the same time, they wanted to control it. I mean, they didn't want it to be something and the main thing was to make sure it had no demands. And I was part of Occupy Wall Street, and I look back on Occupy Wall Street, and one of the biggest things was that there were a lot of people who were being paid to be there, who were full-time organizers, and they had this ultra democracy process. If you agree, you twinkle fingers. If you disagree, you down twinkle. All these hand signs and all of this. But certain people controlled it and got whatever they wanted. And there were certain foundation people that were there being paid, and they ran the whole thing. And one of the things they always insisted on was no demands. You can't ever have any demands. No demands. No demands. No demands. And the arguments they would make were absurd. And my organization, we were trying to push Occupy Wall Street to demand full employment. That was one of the things we pushed. And they said, well, then all the government has to do is give everyone a job, and then the revolution's over. And I'm thinking Yeah. Well, first of all, like the government's not just going to give every person a job, right? That's going to be a big struggle. Second of all, if we were able to win that in the process of a mass movement, that would show people what they could win, and there'd be even bigger protests because people would get more involved. But they had this, no demands, no demands, no demands. We can't have any demands. And we should have just viewed it as a recruiting opportunity. We should have never the mistake that my organization and the leftists made is we thought we were going to go down there and through their democracy process, we would be able to get it to be in line with what we believe. That wasn't going to happen. Right. We should have just viewed it as somebody else's show, basically, and a recruiting opportunity. And we should have done the same thing with the Tea Party, right? Our attitude was Occupy Wall Street, good, and we're going to try to take it over because they're progressive. Tea Party, bad, racist, fascist, or whatever. We hate them. We should have just viewed both of them as a recruiting opportunity, right? Both of them are controlled by somebody else with lots of money, but there's people that are angry at the system there who have a piece of the puzzle, who have a piece of the understanding, and we can go and recruit them to anti-imperialism. That's how we should have viewed it. And there were a lot of people at the Tea Party who understood that, the wars were wrong. It was started by Ron Paul people that were very, very anti-war. They understood that the tax system is rigged in favor of the ultra-rich monopolies, that the Federal Reserve is a ripoff. They had one piece of the puzzle. People at Occupy Wall Street, they had another piece of the puzzle. They knew just money in politics, the 1%, police brutality. So they had one piece of the puzzle, and we should have just viewed both as a recruiting opportunity. We shouldn't have had the attitude of, we're going to take over Occupy Wall Street, because we couldn't have done that. And we shouldn't have had the attitude that, the Tea Party, they're awful people, they're racist, fascist. They're wrong too in their own way. They're confused, but they have a piece of the puzzle, and that's the beginning of a conversation.
To be fair, there was no way for you to know that going into it.
Right.
I mean, you had this upswell of legit anger at a system, and you go in thinking to yourself, okay, well, we're going to try to move this in a particular direction. That's not your fault. It's admirable that you guys were trying to do it. It's kind of hindsight where it's like, okay, these guys were being controlled. This wasn't what we thought it was. That's not your fault, though. That's not, that's a hindsight being 2020.
Well, a pivotal moment for me was the day Gaddafi died, October 20th, 2011. I was in the Occupy Wall Street camp the day Gaddafi was killed. There was a divide in the Occupy Wall Street camp that was a class divide. The trust fund kids, the professional activists, were being paid to be there. They all thought Gaddafi dying was a good thing. And it was working class people, black and white, libertarian, anarchist, black nationalist, others who said Gaddafi had been building an independent currency to, break Africa off the dollar and, have their own gold standard currency in Africa. They viewed Gaddafi as a great anti-imperialist, and it was working class people who supported Gaddafi, and it was rich professional activists who saw Occupy as part of the revolution that brought Gaddafi down. And it was a class division, and that's important to remember. It wasn't about left versus right. The professional left were on the wrong side. But a lot of working class people that were in the camp sympathized with Gaddafi, but the mainstream voices that have been boosted to be the voices of the movement, they didn't support Gaddafi. They saw Gaddafi, and they saw the revolution against Gaddafi as part of what their movement was about. And it was wild, right? They had people that were trying to overthrow the government of Iran, who came and spoke at Occupy. Oh, this is the same struggle, the Iranian government, the 1%, and it was, Occupy Wall Street was very much from above. But there were a lot of people there who were very much opposed to the system. So I don't regret participating, but it's interesting to think about this and how do you intervene when the people are in motion like that? How do you intervene? The main thing right now, taking it to the time we live in, is that there is a false polarization. And this is a thing we made at our convention at the CPI gathering. It's not about woke versus MAGA, right? It really isn't. Everywhere you go in America, red states, blue states, rural, urban, conservative, liberal, wherever you go in America, people know, one, that our government is run by a group of ultra-rich people who don't care about us. Two, our living standards are going down. Three, all these wars around the world don't do a damn thing to make our lives better. They're not for us. Four, we're losing our freedoms very quickly. They're taking our freedoms away. Every corner of America you go to, people agree with that. And we need a polarization that's all the American people who know those things in their bones and want to change them against the ultra-rich monopolies that run the government, that run the military-industrial complex, that run the FBI and the policing agencies that are raging these wars. That's the polarization we need. The polarization we need is not woke versus MAGA, cultural, these kinds of divisions. And we need to repolarize, get beyond the false polarization and get to the real polarization, which is what the overwhelming majority of the American people who are anti-imperialist in their bones at this point know against the imperialists and the big monopolies. That's the polarization that we need. And they're trying their hardest to make sure that doesn't happen. And the wave of political violence, I believe it's a psyop, right? That they are trying to get woke people and MAGA people to shoot each other and kill each other. They want there to be a body count on both sides. So there's trauma, there's rage, and the people that are against the status quo never get together. And that is what needs to change. I want a repolarization to get over this false polarization, right? We need to be against the system, not against people who are also against the system, but in a different way than we are.
Caleb Maupin, from your mouth to God's ears. Caleb Maupin, speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, and author. He is Caleb, I know you're with the Center for Political Innovation, but you are a creator of this, correct? Or one of the creators?
I am, yeah. We founded the organization. We've been having events around the country. We have people that are very active. We've been distributing books about the Houthis. I wrote a book exposing Kamala Harris that, we have been having actions during the elections. We unfurled a big banner of Trump and Kim Jong-un shaking hands. It said, "Only peace can make America great again." That was our intervention during the elections, and it was featured in the New Yorker magazine. And we sponsored Rage Against the War Machine. We're involved in anything we can do to raise anti-imperialism among the American people, get the anti-imperialist message out there. The only future America is going to have is with the new economy that is rising around the world, the BRICS, et cetera. And we need to reorient the United States to be part of the new rising economy in the world, trading with countries on the basis of win-win and investing in people. Right? The source of all value in the world is human labor and human creativity. And we need a government that doesn't invest in destroying people with prisons and bombs and weapons, a government that invests in people, providing education, providing jobs, laying the foundations of an economy with infrastructure. We need a government that invests in people. Our slogan that we use everywhere is we need a government of action that fights for working families. That's the Center for Political Innovation.
Caleb, from your mouth to God's ears, you're fantastic, man. Thank you for this. I really appreciate it. Okay. You be safe.
Always a pleasure.
Have a good one. Yeah. All right.